Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're now going to hear from some members of the town of Nantucket. So we will hear from Chuck Larson, Vince Murphy, and Holly Backus, and then we'll have questions at the end. So again, yes, that's absolutely right. Okay. Chuck Larson joined the town of Nantucket in January 2017 and is currently the manager of strategic projects. He has more than 35 years of experience working in government and the private sector areas of transportation and engineering, transportation management systems, information technology, and GIS, and is known for his ability to collaborate on multidisciplinary projects and deliver solutions. I can attest to that. Chuck has earned BS in civil engineering from the University of Connecticut and a Master of Science in project management from the George Washington University. As a Massachusetts licensed civil engineer and project management professional, Chuck works on a range of projects helping the Nantucket community advance practices for coastal resilience, sustainability planning, adapting to climate change, and designing for sea level rise. His efforts have helped Nantucket obtain municipal vulnerability preparedness certification from the state and several MVP action grants for coastal resilience projects. Vincent Murphy is the Coastal Resilience Coordinator with the Natural Resources Department with the town. Vince is a former environmental consultant and has a Master of Science in Ecosystem Conservation and Landscape Management from the University College Cork in Ireland and is now a proud Irish American. He has lived in several parts of Europe and North America, including Ireland, United Kingdoms, Netherlands, Finland, and Arizona, before settling on Nantucket with his family. For 7 years, Vince worked as an environmental consultant in Ireland, which involved surveying for sensitive habitats and species prior to site development. As plans developed, his consultancy was also involved overseeing project implementation and ensuring projects maintained environmental regulation compliance. Time and experience of environmental practices in these varied countries, most notably including the Netherlands and their flooding issues, has given him the required experience to work on flooding and coastal erosions on Nantucket. In Nantucket, we do consider ourselves to be a separate country sometimes. We think that we are, so you can add that to your list. This is the staffer for the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee, which has the acronym CRAC. Vince, as the CRAC advisor, or rather as the Coastal Resilience Coordinator with direction and assistance from CRAC, will develop and implement the Coastal Resilience Plan to alleviate flooding and erosion in coastal zones around the island in the face of climate change and sea level rise. And Holly Backus has been a land use planner for almost 15 years. In November of 2019, she was promoted as the first preservation planner for the town of Nantucket. In addition, she's the town's local hazard mitigation plan coordinator and successfully managed the project to update the plan for FEMA approval in March 2019. She's highly involved in the town's resiliency and sustainability planning efforts. In addition, she is the staff liaison with both the Nantucket Historical Commission and the Nantucket Historic District Commission, and occasionally participates with the town's Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. She's a bachelor's degree in historic preservation and art and archaeology from art and architectural history from Roger Williams University and a graduate certificate from UNF's Preservation Institute, Nantucket. After college, she was a land use planner for Berkeley County, South Carolina for approximately 10 years. She's a Nantucket native and happy to be back helping her island plan appropriately for the future of the island's historic and cultural resources with the changing climate. Please join me welcoming Chuck, Vince, and Holly.
All right. Thank you, Mary. I assume you can hear me. Yes. So it's nice to be here and the ability to participate in this virtual event. Big thank you to you, Mary, and to the conference leaders and sponsors for organizing the past 2 days with some exceptional topics and speakers. And as a community, we're grateful to have the opportunity to work together, to learn, to share ideas, develop plans and actions to preserve Nantucket for future generations. In this session, we have 3 presentations, as Mary has teed up, and they highlight some of the work that we've been doing recently, followed with the opportunity for a panel discussion and question and answer at the end within the time allotted. And so I'm starting off. And the topic of my presentation is sea level rise and the effects we are seeing now. And this is hyperlocal and figuratively, looking right out our front door. And we've all seen the images of major storms, major events, past storms with water levels measured in feet of flooding depth. You might be expecting more pictures and imagery similar to what we've seen with Marty and the Keeping History Above Water conference, and then the work that he did with the terrestrial LiDAR generated visualizations. Those images, in a very dramatic and powerful way, help us understand what the future might hold for us. My presentation looks at sea level rise from a slightly different yet equally important perspective, high tide flooding, as observed today. And what I'm talking about is flooding of locations of lower elevation having water depths of several inches or more and not necessarily tied to a major storm event. This is also called nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. Easy Street is a low-lying roadway with sidewalks along the edge of Nantucket Harbor between Strait Wharf and Steamship Wharf in the downtown area. It's a very busy corridor and is one of the first areas to flood with higher water levels and higher tides. And what I have for you in the next 12 slides is an interesting fact-based presentation of what's happening now, how conditions are changing, and yet a subtle but dramatic way. And so next slide, please. So here's an example of nuisance flooding on Easy Street and Lower Broad Street. Image on the left is Easy Street looking up southwest from along Lower Broad. The image on the right is really Easy Street, and where the vehicles are going, hopefully you can see the image in the water. That's Oak Street right there. And so this is an event I captured. It was just by chance in November 2018. And it started with a curiosity and actually grew into this case study, which required more research. So in my short time at Nantucket, I saw lots of examples of flooding, especially with the work early on with the Department of Public Works. But something about this situation, spoke to me. And next slide. So Easy Street is a short street, but it's a critical transportation link for trucks, for equipment, for people going to the Steamship Authority terminal, access to Lower Broad Street. It's a major corridor for pedestrians and tourists. And interestingly enough, the Easy Street bulkhead was rebuilt in 2017 to provide an additional level of protection to the sidewalk and roadway. And the timber cap of the bulkhead was set at an elevation of 5 feet, mean high water. Now, it wasn't necessarily designed to protect the street from flooding due to storm surge, but it was to minimize the effects. And it added several feet of height to what was the existing bulkhead that was there. And it also should be noted that storm drains at the bulkhead are fitted at black flow devices to minimize flooding during higher water elevations in the harbor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But more recently, flooding of Easy Street has been observed at some higher tides. And next slide, please. So engineers at heart are problem solvers. So I said this spoke to me. It certainly didn't keep me up at night, but it was something that was more of a curiosity. How often does this occur? Why is it happening? We have backflow devices on the drains. How can this be happening? What information exists to really help us take a deeper look into this. And this is certainly not a pressing matter, but when we're looking at flooding and water and infrastructure, it always is. So I thought about this, and it was nothing that was a full-time thing. But the question came to be, what information can be gathered? And so it's pretty simple. You put two and two together. Nantucket is fortunate to have a great piece of equipment located just a few hundred feet away. And next slide. And it happens to be the NOAA tide gauge. And can you, I guess, click it again to bring up the text? All right, go ahead and click through and fill out the slide. We have some animation that is perfect. Oh, one back. We have some animation that we'll work to figure out. But essentially, we have a tide gauge right in Nantucket Harbor, several hundred feet from the Easy Street location. It has continuously recorded electronic information going back 50 years, back to 1965. And NOAA uses the information as part of their tide gauge network, 100 or several hundred tide gauges throughout the country. And within the NOAA website, you can access some of the canned reports that I've displayed. They're kind of difficult to see, but Marty showed one of them, which was the top 10 highest water levels in the harbor. You can also get information on the fluctuation of hourly and 6-minute interval water levels. And then also they provide some analytics in terms of the rise in sea level over time, which is that bottom right image there. So kind of like a data junkie, I got familiar with that and figured, there might be something here that could be useful. And so next slide, please. The image I just showed you with the flooding taken November 28th, 2018, had a specific timestamp on that and was able to go into the tide gauge records and pull up a report that was able to then tell me the confirmed water level as measured at the time gauge at that time. And you probably can't see it very well, but that top graph that looks like a sine wave. The blue line is the predicted water level, and the green line was the actual water level recorded for that day. And so the tide gauge does track what's expected and what actually occurs and what's verified. So the actual verified water depth was 1.65 feet mean high water. And that resulted in a water depth at Oak Street of about 6 inches. I didn't go down there and measure it, but it certainly appears to be of that depth, especially with the truck that's driving through that. And it just so happened that truck is David Gray of the sewer department. And so he picked me up, and we actually drove through Brant Point and into the boat ramp, and we were just taking pictures of the high water for that event. And one thing to note, as a part of the analysis, I did go back and check rainfall data, because you often see water that remains on the road, and it's often because of the previous day's precipitation. And in this case, the precipitation in the previous 48 hours was simply about 0.6 of an inch, and really had minor, if any, contribution to the water we were seeing on the roadway at that time. So next slide. Here's a similar observation I did about a year later. Went through the same process. The water level was confirmed at 1.1 feet mean high water. Depth of water at Easy and Oak Street was less. And again, rainfall in the previous 72 hours was almost negligible. And I had several more observations, and all seemed to follow a similar trend: depth of water and your readings in the tide gauge. And so this led to a research question: how often does this occur, or how often are conditions right for this to occur? And next slide, please. So going back to the first observation, 1.8 feet mean high water, or approximately 6 inches of water at Oak Street on Easy Street. I downloaded 40 years of data from the tide gauge from January 1st, January 1st, 1980 to December 31st, 2019. Every day, every hour, every 6 minutes for that time period, except for the brief times that the data just wasn't available. And I performed a basic query of that information after organizing it at these defined thresholds that I had just spoken of. And so I'm showing here a distribution. The x-axis are the years. On the left is 1980, going across to 2019. And then the y-axis is simply a count of the number of days per year. And so the table is probably a little bit easier to see. And that represents the average frequency for that 10-year period, for that decade. The 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And so noticed a very distinct step trend as the frequency is increasing over time. Interestingly enough, I started this analysis working backwards from 2020 to 1980 because I was always expecting, that there'd be some normalization or, just some increase that would be represented. And after going back to 1980, I could go back for another, 10 years, but I got busy with a few other things. But I guess what this shows is that at this particular water elevation in the past 10 years, 2010 to 2019, it occurred once every 79 days or almost 5 times a year. And then jump back to 1980 to 1989. That's we have one record, one occurrence in that entire decade. It's rather substantial information that, hey, over a long range time and over, certainly a tidal epoch, where we're seeing this kind of change, and not dramatic, but enough that I started thinking about it. And then next slide, please. Same kind of analysis, but for the depth of 1 to 2 inches on Easy Street at Oak Street. Same trend, but a much larger frequency. And the chart tells the story very clearly. What we're seeing in the past 10 years was this water level on average every 10 days or 35 times a year. In 1980 to 1989, it was every 63 days or about 6 times a year. So we are seeing some real effects of sea level rise, in addition to all the other information that's been developed and published so far. And so, NOAA does use their data for analysis, but this is, again, looking hyperlocal at Nantucket and what's happening now. So next slide, please. So what's happening? So certainly we're experiencing high tide flooding with water that's backflowing into the stormwater system, into the drainage pipes and up through the catch basins. And when the water elevation is just right, it'll start appearing on the surface of the road. And it's having water in this type of condition really depends on the elevation of the road. And Easy Street happens to be a low-lying road, so that at about 1.1 feet mean high water, water will start to appear. There are, as I mentioned earlier, check valves or backflow valves on the outlets to the drainage system that supports Easy Street. Can't see it very well, but those outlets have actually deformed and are not sealing tightly, and hence they're staying open all the time. And that's what's being shown on the images to the bottom right there. There's 3 outlets. The one that's on the far right is really directly connected to those catch basins on Easy Street at Oak Street. And the image at the left shows a graphic illustration that simply, under normal and design conditions that were once in place, that, the water levels were always going to be below the level of the outfall. But under certain cases, storms, king tides, higher high tides, water levels actually can and sometimes will, backflow onto the roadway. And so, so what we're, over longer periods, while this is not a huge attention, headline attention grabbing situation, it does, continually impact the infrastructure, and something we should probably, think about in terms of addressing longer term. So next image, please. So in addition to high tide flooding, NOAA and the National Weather Service actually have classifications for flooding, where they've identified Nantucket specific levels at which it's considered minor, moderate, and major flooding. And the 1.8 feet mean higher high water is the threshold just into minor flooding. And certainly the information's available here. There's a lot of information online. Nuisance flooding is really that flooding that does not reach the NOAA threshold and is therefore not reported. And so for easy street, nuisance flooding is about 1 or 1.1 feet mean higher high water. And next slide. So in summary, went through very, very quickly. Climate change sea level rise is happening now, not just in the future. And we're fortunate to have the tide gauge, and it's probably something we ought to spend more time, using and getting familiar with. And there's a great quote from somebody at NOAA: today's flood will become tomorrow's high tide. And with that, I am wrapped up. Next slide. And just quickly, Easy Street over the years from 1880s to 2020, how it's changed. Easy Street's always lived with water, especially what you can see in the 1960s in that upper right photograph there, sand, seaweed along the edge and the bulkhead there. This could probably be a topic of a whole nother talk, but these are images, on Easy Street looking towards Steamboat Wharf. And with that, I am done, and we'll turn it over to Vince.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm just going to try and share screen, Rita. All right. Hi, everyone. Just going to give a quick overview of some of the issues and how we're going about getting a coastal resilience plan for the town. This image here on the left is actually something that I like to talk about at the start of most of these types of talks. It's the emoji for sea level rise, with the buildings and the little person suffering from waves coming up. So just want to talk a little bit about coastal resilience and NOAA's definition. So in the way NOAA words it is, coastal resilience means building the ability of a community to bounce back after hazardous events such as hurricanes, coastal storms and flooding, rather than simply reacting to impacts. This is a nice definition, but it doesn't really include Nantucket's erosion problem. And it also doesn't really take into account much for our historic status. But what we can do is reword it a little bit so that we can be sensitive to both, somewhat more sensitive to both, and also that take into account our historic structures will be dealt with in a separate plan that Holly will talk more about, as well as Lisa Craig later. So the improved definition that we've been working with is coastal community resilience planning seeks to improve the capacity of a community exposed to extreme natural events to adapt to stress and change by resisting or changing in order to reach and maintain an acceptable level of function. I think Chuck was one of the people involved in drafting that, by the way, and thank you very much. So that's great, but now let's just have a quick look at the resilience cycle. I'm sure everyone has seen this before. It starts at the top, where we look at where you assess risk and vulnerability. Then you go ahead and you develop some plans and some priorities, and then you implement them. Then there's the the waiting, the agony of waiting, have a hazardous event, then your plans kick in and you move into the recovery and action part. You then have to monitor and evaluate what happened. Was the planning enough? Was the adaptation enough? What do we have to do? So you start all over again by looking at your risk and vulnerability. It's a continual cycle, but the whole point is to look at continually improving resilience. So Nantucket has big problems we're aware of. We know it. Water is coming and erosion happens. These are famous bumper stickers at this point, and it's just something you have to get ready for. By the way, I also quite like that there's a Feelies bumper sticker on this car. Have to Love, a nice band from the early 80s. So I just want to go through, I know Chuck talked about high tide flooding, and that is a big problem and one of the kind of daily problems, or becoming a daily problem, of sea level rise. But I'm just going to look at storms quite briefly. In February, we had what was considered a medium storm of sorts. It brought flooding to Easy Street, water backed up, got onto the street, and it caused some washover at Comet Pond. Just to say it, resilience measures could improve both of these and lessen the impacts. Then about a month to the day later, in March, we had what was at the time called a Cape Scraper storm. It just passed up the coast, and we saw some impacts from that. Here in the corner of Easy Street and Oak Street, looking towards the back door of the Dreamland, you can see some of the familiar flooding that we've all come to think of every time there's a winter storm. Likewise, Broad Street, and then over on Easton Street, and this is at the corner of Willard Street, or just off the corner of Willard Street, to be more precise, looking down Easton Street towards the NCF marsh on the left-hand side. So the impact on this storm was mainly storm surge. There wasn't as much erosion impact, it was quite limited. Then about a month later again, we had another winter storm, April. This had more impacts. It had storm surge that we can see here, two examples from opposite ends of the town, so to speak, from Easton Street, looking the other way this time, and also from the corner of Washington Street and Francis Street. So that storm also had quite a large impact from erosion. This is Codfish Park down in Sconset, where there was wave run up onto the beach. Then just down the road, on Low Beach Road, by the old sewer beds in Sconset at Beach Access 32, they lost about 100 feet of beach in that one event. And then out on Smith's Point, it basically made the area undrivable right up to the way the condition of the beach is now, so that people still can't really drive there due to erosion. So that's 3 storms in 3 months, but then we had another, oh sorry, just to finish that, the main impact of those storms was moderate to local severe erosion on the south and east shore, as well as some amount of storm surge. And this is the point, different storms have different impacts. But just moving on a little bit, within the last couple of days, we've had a high surf advisory from Hurricane Paulette. This was a storm, at the time, Category 2 hurricane that passed about 500 miles away from Nantucket, but we still saw the effects as we had high surf and localized erosion. So most of the pictures up until now are pictures that I took myself. So I have to give credit to Jeff Carlson, Director of Natural Resources, credit for this one because he took it. This is at the property on Hummock Pond that suffered from the erosion from Hurricane Paulette, from the wave run-up from the high surf advisory. And also another view of it from Kind Flow Productions, and a special thank you to Spruce. And these pictures were taken from the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy Facebook page, and thank you to that group as well. So this is an erosion event, but we have to take a couple of things into account with it. This house had been planned to move anyway, but it was going to move in at some stage in the fall. But because of this, it had its foundations exposed and lost its road access. So this became an imminent move, and it's going to move quite soon. So we now have looked at storms, we've looked at erosion, and we have to ask the question, is this regular erosion, or is it erosion that is speeding up due to sea level rise? And that's my segue into talking about the new nemesis, sea level rise. So we know these things here in Nantucket. We've come to deal with them over time. But sea level rise will make these worse. This is a chart that Chuck showed. It's a chart that I've showed on many occasions in the past, and it's a chart that I really quite like. It's in meters. The 0 year is in 1992, and the point of it is, from our local tide gauge on Steamship Wharf, as Chuck said, is that it shows over time about 3.7 millimeters of rise per year, or about 37.5 millimeters per decade, if you like to look at it that way. As much as I like this graph, I kind of wanted to make it easier for myself to understand. So I changed it a little bit. So the previous graph was monthly data. This I have changed to annual data. So this is the mean sea level per year. So it's the same base data as before, but it's annual instead of monthly. I've converted it to inches just because I understand both systems, but some people prefer inches, and a lot of the time I do. And I moved the 0 year back to 1965. There is a problem that this does lose accuracy, but it just helps for understanding. But now that we've gone through this process, what does this tell us? It shows about 0.14 inches of sea level rise per year, about 1.4 inches per decade. But then the cumulative from 1965 up until 2019 was just about 8 inches of sea level rise. So Chuck has also had was also the source of this graph, and I have to thank him for it. He has put in the arrows for the NOAA intermediate high scenario and the NOAA intermediate scenario. Now let's just look at this graph and take some information from it. First of all, we have this squiggly line here, and that represents the 8 inches of sea level rise that we've already seen. And it goes up to almost 2020. But now let's project forward. Where does this take us into the future? If you look at the NOAA intermediates, that is 4.33 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, the bar in the furthest right axis. Then the intermediate high, just to make sure that everyone knows, is kind of the top end of what we might expect, but we are only talking about expect, not will have, and that goes up to 6.56 feet. The pink line, second from highest, is the high scenario. That goes up to 9.25 feet by the year 2100. And just to make a plug for the recent recommendation that the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee made that was accepted by the Select Board on August 5th, they are recommending that for the next year, until we have a coastal resilience plan, that we use the high scenario in planning. And thank you to all in the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee for working on that, and for all who are attending here today. So now we know what's going to happen. Let's start planning. What are our options? So I'm kind of taking the 10,000 foot view here of the planning options. So we have structural resiliency and planning resiliency. Let's take planning resiliency first. We can get ready with emergency preparation and response. We can do redirection and retreat of development, or we can look at procedural and regulatory and financial modifications. They're the kind of 3 key tenets for the planning side of things. Then let's have a look at structural. This can be anything from seawalls and bulkheads, flood walls, levees. We could even do, well, potentially do groins and jetties, temporary flood barriers, and then for buildings themselves, we could look at flood proofing or even elevating the buildings. But we have to look at these in context. The structural resilience is all about scale. It can be at the site-specific scale. It could even be at the neighborhood scale. It could be at a large scale that takes in the whole downtown area. But all of these come down to 2 critical things. First, water management. That is one of the things we have to get right. The other thing we really have to get right is managing people's expectations. It is just something that we're going to have to always take into account, what people expect and then what can reasonably be achieved, and let everyone know that. So we've looked at structural resilience. Let's go into that just a little bit more. So the basic structural adaptation strategies are to accommodate water, to protect from it, and to retreat. So let's just dig into these just a little bit more. This one here on the left is an example that's not from Nantucket. It's a house on stilts On Nantucket, this would have to have breakaway panels and various other things to meet HDC guidelines, etc. And that is for others to talk about. The center picture that represents protect. This is an example from Dionis. The bulkhead on the left, there's a bulkhead on the left, and on the right, there's a rock revetment that protects both of these areas from erosion. Then on the right, I saw that Marty had this image already. It shows a retreat. This is from the Toscana website, and it shows a house on Hummock Pond Road, not too far from my previous example of a house that suffered from erosion. But it does show that people do have to retreat in certain areas. So one of the things that we want to do, and that I'm working so very hard to with the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee, is to getting a coastal resilience plan. But this plan will have to work in complement with other plans, such as the hazard mitigation plan that Holly worked on, that was accepted and completed in April 2019. And this contains many recommendations that will improve island resilience in general. And it's aimed at general public safety. The difference with the Coastal Resilience Plan is that it will be about partly filling in gaps in the HMP and looking for flooding and erosion in coastal zone resilience. There's also the Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaption that Holly and Lisa Craig and the Thompson Group have been working on. This is aimed at historic districts and the historic structure of the island. The Coastal Resilience Plan will work in concert with the project, and there will be a lot of overlap with them. The advantage is that the historic area and structure will already be somewhat dealt with and have had quite a large amount of consideration already. There's also a plan for storm drains work, and that's in progress. And this is going to investigate the public storm drain network and island understanding that we have and recommend for potential improvements. And then the last one is a climate action plan. This is going to be undertaken by Larson, as I understand it, or she's doing the research for it. And this will investigate and make recommendations on energy consumption and climate resilience. So then we have to look at what's going to go into a coastal resilience plan. What's the structure? How do we get there? So this is where the methods really kicked in. We had to work together and develop a coastal resilience, develop a request for proposals. This was done with between myself as the Coastal Resilience Coordinator and the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. Sent to procurement. It was posted. Then the next phase is to secure a contract with a consultant. That'll take approximately 12 months. Then it will have to be reviewed. There will have to be much community engagement along the way and at the end to make sure it's all acceptable. And then finally, the consultants will deliver it. And then it should be sent to the select board for approval. Then we move on to the implementation side of things. This is kind of where things get fun. So that's only just getting the plan. But now that we have it, the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, which is my work at the moment, is to find funding for these projects. And then CRAC will review and aid in project selection and looking at the various adaptation options, taking all the infrastructure into account. And I would imagine, or at least from my personal point of view, hope that there's more green and grey infrastructure where possible. But it will all come back down to water management and particularly helping our wetlands and helping them to recover and expand and giving them areas to move into in the future. It'll also look at erosion management where possible, and also the policy changes that might be required to deal with flooding, to deal with erosion, to deal with retreat. And then, because it's a circular system, we'll continue to review and look at adaptation opportunities. So this is what we did first. This is where I worked with the committee so heavily in developing the request for proposals. And we had to do, including the committee and their recommendations. It's unusual for a committee to have this level of input, but it also underlines the importance of the plan and also shows the expertise on the committee and the available resources that we have here right on island. So we got that far, but this is where we are now. We secured a contract with the consultants. So this is a nice way of looking at it, but I sometimes like a visual. So, excuse me, we have done most of the development phase. The red line at around 9 months there indicates where we are. We've literally within the last week finished within the development phase, and we're about to go into the production and review phase. The consultants, Arcadis with their sub-consultants Stoss and also Lisa Craig Group, are on board for this, and they are going to be getting going quite soon. I've had an initial meeting with them, and we're getting underway. So it took longer than expected. There's no way to put it. Oh, the way to put it, that it did take a long time to develop the RFP. We had to do it this way. We had to get it right, and it takes longer to get a better product. Also, it has to be said that COVID did delay us by 2 months, but we've also come back on track. We're into the development phase just a little after the 9-month mark, considering that this started in December of last year. So the ultimate goals of resilience, and just a note for Holly, this is my second to last slide. We want to reduce the financial loss, make events that cost a lot of money cost less, flooding cost less. We also want to reduce the time frame that impacts take up. If it could be something like you can get a flooding event fixed in a week instead of 2 months, that would be terrific. We have to bounce back, get back to regular business faster, have our tourists here, have our beaches being used, and have the tourist dollars coming into our local economy. We also want to increase the longevity of the island. This is an erosion map of the island over time from 1800s up until 2009. We've lost some land. Let's try and dial that back. So resilience is a process, and I started close with this, and I just have to end with this by saying we're always planning to improve resilience. And that is my presentation.
So resiliency and preservation planning for the National Historic Landmark. So everyone knows that Nantucket is a National Historic Landmark. We became a National Historic Landmark in 1955, we became a local historic district in 1955. Our forefathers definitely had the understanding that we had something unique here. 1955 is also the year that the town enacted the subdivision control law for the island. And then in 1966, which is actually when the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted, Nantucket went through the nomination process to become a National Historic Landmark, which is prior to any other land use regulations like the zoning bylaw, which was in 1972. 1966, the Association of the American Whaling Industry and the Survival of the Architecture and Ambiance of the Early Whaling Port was the reason for that nomination. And then through a CPC funds, which I was a proponent for way back when I was in high school, at Nantucket High School, the CPC funds helped go through was acquired so that the update to the NHL could be done in 2012, and that included the national significance of tourism and historic preservation to that update, and also include the significance to both Tuckanut and Muskeget and the entire island of Nantucket. So here's a historic photograph, thanks to the NHA for their information that is readily available on the web. This is Easy Street Boat Basin from the 1880s. As you can see, it really shows what was going on at that time frame, and also it's really unique because it gives you a perspective from the harbor, which a lot of the photographs that we've seen are not showing. Another angle from the 1890s, looking at the Easy Street Boat Basin from the Steamboat Wharf, and looking at all those structures. Resiliency and preservation planning really go hand in hand. And it wasn't until I went to a Keeping History Above Water conference and heard Lisa Craig talk about her initiatives, which she'll talk more about later on this afternoon. But I learned that we need to put our historical cultural resources within our hazard mitigation plan, no doubt. And this is a document from FEMA, basically outlining the strategy on getting our historical cultural resources within the hazard plan. And I came back and presented that to the select board. And at the time, our hazard mitigation plan was not updated, need to be updated. We received FEMA funding for that update, for the planning of it, and it fell in my lap. And I'm glad to say that we have our historical cultural resources within the plan, which was something that was not there when the original document was done in 2007. However, it's nothing like the initiative that Lisa did down in Maryland. So maybe we'll get there at some point. So of course, our hazard mitigation plan was updated in 2019. That was an interesting process, a different planning process that I was used to. But nonetheless, it was a planning process and we got it approved. And as you can see here, it was to mitigate the detriment impacts of natural hazards to Nantucket while maintaining and enhancing the island's quality of life, historic essence, aesthetic beauty, and natural habitat resources. And I'm very happy that we were able to bring the historic aspect into the plan. So with that, and all these planning initiatives kind of happened all at once, and I'm very grateful to be able to work with Chuck and now Vince as well. But we went through after the plan was adopted and the strategies were identified. These are 2 historic district type strategies that came out of the HMP. We had about 33 strategies, I believe, and I think about 10% were already achieved or in the process at the time of adoption. But these 2 strategies right out of the HMP, are very, very important. And this is the catalyst, if you will, for moving forward with Resilient Nantucket. Chuck got us into the MVP planning process. We became an MVP community in 2019, I believe, 18-19. All the last couple of years have merged together for me, so I apologize. But the top 5 actions to improve resilience were the resiliency coordinator, which obviously we've completed with the promotion of Vince. Very happy to work with him. The isolation from the mainland, wetland restoration, historic preservation guidelines, and road system resiliency. And of course, we have an ongoing action grant from MVP to create those historic preservation guidelines, which would be an addendum onto building with Nantucket in mind. There's the document. So that action grant to preserve historic streetscapes while mitigating hazards. Of course, that's going above and beyond of what the FEMA regulations require you to have in a plan. Because at the end of the day, if we have a natural hazard and we don't have a approved FEMA plan, and for a while there, we were in limbo with not having an approved plan, we're least likely to receive federal funding in a natural disaster. So of course, now we have that approved plan, and it's a not stagnant document. It is an ongoing, ever evolving, added onto as far as how the priorities are done and achieved. So this MVP grant is actually being used to help facilitate and achieve those 2 priorities that deal with our historic resources that are specific to our National Historic Landmark. So here's an interesting photo I found from NHA from 1930s with flooding along Easy Street. You can see in the foreground where the homes are, and then you could see where the street is. Looks like probably a nor'easter of some sort. And then the working wharves to the right and the left. Here is, 40 years later, I can't add, with 1970s flooding. And then I remember this as a child, the No Name storm in 1991. with flooding around the Dreamland, and then obviously up towards Easy Street, and then you see that structure at the end, which has been since relocated. And then this was the storm winter storm in 2018. I was home on maternity leave with my youngest at the time. And then this is interesting. So Nantucket, as we all know, has evolved over, let me say, 300 years. We've been evolving from moving structures here and there. We continue to do that. But we've built in areas that have been low-lying, not knowing that they're low-lying. And I thought this was interesting. So this was a plan from 1896 of Straight Wharf and Old North Wharf, where the land in between was proposed to be filled with earth, brick, and rubbish. I thought that was interesting. I don't know if anybody's done any excavating down there at all, but I just thought this was pretty cool to indicate what we as men, as mankind, have done to our low-lying marshy areas that we've built upon. And here's in 1897, so a year after that plan was approved by the town. This is where some of the filling has been, and I believe this is a gentleman right here filling it in as we speak. Some great photographs in that area of the basin being filled. And then, so now what are we doing for our National Historic Landmark? We are basically going through and we're doing great things. I will say, and it's a group effort. I feel very, very fortunate to be able to work with so many extraordinary people in the world of resiliency, preservation. It's fantastic. We're working on a lot of different things. And in the world of COVID, we're still moving forward. With this MVP Action Grant, of course, you all know Resilient Nantucket, from the work that PIN has done, for the work that Lisa and her team is working on for us. We're going to be creating these design guidelines, following obviously the Secretary of the Interior standards for adaptation. And so thankful that that document came out last year. I understand it's going to be illustrated later this year, but we need to make sure that our historic streetscapes and our historic structures are being accommodated. Whether we are accommodating, which I think, Nantucket, we've been resilient for so many years, and we're not that big, so I can't see us wanting to retreat. Where are we going to retreat to? Alta Rock, the dump? We can't. We need to accommodate. We need to accommodate our structures. We need to accommodate our history. And then I'm very happy to be able to be a part of the Coastal Resiliency Plan and the planning of that. I, been very appreciative at the end of the day to be able to see that cohesion between our historic integrity of the NHL and making sure that we are doing that appropriately. And then also, how do we tie in the environment aspect and making sure, can we have some more green infrastructure? Can we utilize our existing wetlands? Those are very, very important things. So I'm very happy to see that we'll be working with Arcadis and their team. Also, from the preservation for the town perspective, of course, as the liaison between both the HDC and the Historical Commission, we have been talking about applying to be a certified local government under the National Park Services realm, something that I've been near and dear to my heart since as early as the age of 16, when I started interning at the Nantucket Preservation Trust, understanding and learning more about it when I went to college, scratching my head going, why isn't Nantucket a certified local government? And I'm happy to say, there is momentum in that, and this will help us receive additional funding from the federal government, because only a certain percentage will go to them for certified local governments. This will help us with our historic surveys and our inventory, because we all know not all of our surveys are up to date. This also gives us additional assistance with the State Historic Preservation Office, which is Massachusetts Historical. And again, this is a joint collaboration with the HDC and the NHC. At the end of the day, it will require select board approval, and they this is on their radar, and know that we've are pushing for this type of collaboration. And then, of course, at the end of the day, too, I'm very appreciative to be able to continue working with NPT, continue working with University of Florida's PIN program, and others in the world of preservation and resiliency. And I'm looking forward to seeing what PIN comes up with their design guidelines and their approaches, I should say. The uniform height for the first floor BFE is fantastic. HDC needs it. They're looking for it, and I know they're looking forward to getting guidelines that will work with our historic district. If everybody has not heard, I hope you have already, that our first phase of our community forum that was rescheduled from March due to COVID, we're going to be having that tomorrow morning and tomorrow evening with our consultant, Lisa Craig, and a couple of other folks. So I hope you all can join us. And that is it.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly and Chuck. And unfortunately, we are over time, but I did put everybody's emails in the chat. If folks have questions that they would like to direct to Holly, Vince, and Chuck. And I just want to thank you so much for all of your updates. I'm going to copy Margaret's question because it's a good one, and we'll email it to Holly to make sure that she gets it. And maybe Holly could answer that question in the chat of Lisa's presentation, which is, would we lose our NHL status if the buildings were lifted? And I think that the thought process is changing. You know, as we heard about yesterday from Aaron about, you know, the ideas regarding separating buildings from their foundation and how that is evolving and developing. So we will stay tuned for that. And thanks to everyone. And we will see you over at Lisa's presentation.